Okay, as you can well imagine, we're going to focus on the festival of Purim today. Firstly, I would like to thank you for all your comments concerning my son's teaching. I'm thrilled to know that he did well, but I'm not surprised. And Bezras Hashem, you'll have other opportunities to learn with him and from him again. The Shir is sponsored for the year by Dr. and Mrs. Menachem Marcus in memory of their beloved aunts, Irma Haas and Hilda Meyer. Once again, we thank them very much for their generous sponsorship for the year. Okay, we're going to start off with a rabbinic debate that is halacha lemaaseh, that is actual law this year, and we're going to then set that aside and come back to it at the end. The rabbinic debate is at the beginning on the first section on your page number 1. When do you celebrate Purim during a leap year? When there are 2 months of Adar. And the rabbis, of course, debate, and they come up with 2 different positions. The first position, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that B'chol shana v'shana, Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi says, B'chol shana Adar hasamuch l'shvat, that you should celebrate the festival of Purim and all its accompanying events should be celebrated during the first month of Adar. Why? Ein ma'avirin ala mitzvot. When you have an opportunity to perform a mitzvah, you don't hesitate, you do it right away. That's it. Along comes Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and says, no. You celebrate it during the month that's close to Nisan. Mesamech geula legeula adif. It is better to keep the geula story, the redemption story of Purim, close to the redemption story of Pesach. And if you look at this debate and its conclusion, you really have to ask yourselves why the rabbis decided as they did. Ein ma'avirin al ha-mitzvot. You don't delay a mitzvah is an important principle that courses through all of Jewish law. And therefore one would assume that that would be the operant principle here. Why do I have to celebrate Purim close to Pesach? The 2 holidays are vastly different. One is a rabbinic festival, one is a biblical festival. Purim celebrates a discrete event that occurred at one particular juncture of Jewish history. Pesach celebrates the totality of Jewish history. Look at the Haggadah from the beginning of our story, from Yetzias Mitzrayim up and through Yemos HaMashiach. Why does Purim have to be celebrated in the shadow of Pesach? Why do we decide that that's the law? So I'm asking you to consider that. Store it in your brains for a moment. We will come back to it at the end of the class. Let's now begin to study Purim. Purim occurs when in Jewish history? That in order to understand the importance of Purim, we have to understand its juncture in Jewish history. So if you take a look at the quick timeline I have for you, patriarchal period, Egyptian slavery, etc., etc., you get to the point of the 6th United Kingdom. That's the point where only 3 kings rule over an undivided nation of Israel, and those are the kings of Shaul, David, and Shlomo, right? And then, after the death of Shlomo, the kingdom divides. You have the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judea. Ultimately, Israel is dispersed. The 10 tribes are lost. All that's left is Judea. And the Babylonians conquer Judea. The Babylonians exiled the Judeans to Babylonia in what is a pretty comfortable exile. If you have to be in exile, the Babylonian exile isn't so bad. You have your own community, you have an exilarch, you have someone in charge of the Jewish community, you're allowed a lot of freedoms. 70 years or so later, Persia conquers Babylon. And Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, issues an edict allowing the Jews to return, the Judeans to return, to rebuild the temple. What percentage of Jews return?
Very little.
Very few. Less than 10%. Less than 10%. Why? You got it. It's nice in Babylonia. Why should I give up, why should I leave Englewood, New Jersey? It's very nice. Why should I come worry about what's happening over there? I'll stay here and say L'shon haba b'Yerushalayim. Thank you very much. And it is at that juncture when the exile of force becomes an exile of choice, it's at that juncture that the Purim story occurs. And the Purim story emerges as a paradigm. It's an unusual festival. It's a paradigmatic festival. What do I mean by that? The Jews see Purim as a discrete event, but they see it repeating itself over and over again in Jewish history in its own way. And if you want proof of that, go to the Encyclopedia Judaica, look up Purim, and you will see a full page, and more than a full page, of Purims that were celebrated across the face of history. If you turn to the next page, I have just a couple of them. Just a couple of them are listed here. And what happened in each of these cases is the community or the family involved experienced a near tragic event. Miraculously were saved, and they celebrated. And what did they call it? Purim. So you have the Purim of Ancona, and the Purim of the bandits, and the Purim of Cairo, and the Purim of Hebron, and the Purim of Narvon, and Purim of Rhodes. And each one of these is stories. Each one of these have their own stories. But you see how the Jewish nation viewed Purim. Purim was a paradigm. This is a story of an exiled community miraculously saved, and the story will be repeated across the face of history in various different places in various different times, and therefore this is a paradigmatic festival. And if it's a paradigmatic festival, then I would argue that the lessons it teaches, both in terms of the festival itself, but also in terms of the people involved and the characters involved, and we'll see how much time we have today to cover all of this. If we can't cover it all, we'll do some next time as well. There are a series of events, a series of lessons that emerge from the festival, and let's start with those. Number one, v'nahafochu. Right? Two words found in the Megillah. What do they mean? What does the phrase v'nahafochu mean? It was overturned. It was changed. The first thing you learn from the Purim festival is that when you live in exile, and by the way, this also holds true for Israel as in its relationship to the community of nations. Just as it's true for exile communities and in terms of their lessons, it's true for us in terms of how we view ourselves in the community of nations. The first thing is v'nahafochu. You choose to live in exile. You choose to live in an uncertain, turbulent world. Things will change in an instant. The story begins. There's a party in Achashverosh's palace. Who's celebrating in that party? Not just everybody, the Jews. The Jews are there, according to Chazal. Up comes Haman, all of a sudden, Jews are destroyed. Comes Esther, the Jews are saved. Turns on a dime. Turns on a dime. How many times has that happened to us throughout our history? How many times have friends suddenly become foes and foes suddenly become friends, and you can't trust either of them because the next thing will happen, they'll become foes again? How many times have we seen our fortunes change in an instant? So that's lesson number one that emerges from Purim as a paradigmatic festival. You live in exile, you choose to stay here, you're choosing to stay in a world that is turbulent and unstable. And your fate depends not only on what you do, but on others as well. Next. This is also an important juncture in terms of Hashem's relationship with his nation. Purim marks the end of the prophetic era and the beginning of God's hidden face. You had it, and this is a little involved, you had it in the patriarchal era when you got to Yosef, where God spoke, and then when you get to Yosef, he's silent. Yosef is in the patriarchal era, he is the figure of the non-prophetic time, when God isn't speaking. And what makes Yosef great is he sees God in the events, even though God doesn't outright appear. The rabbis say, Esther min HaTorah minayin, they ask. How do I know Esther from the Torah? Now, that's a strange question, is it not? Right? Esther from the Torah? Thousands of years later she lived. How could she be found in the Torah? And how do they answer? Who knows? Vanochi aster haster ponai vayom hazeh. I will hide my face. Now, at first glance, it looks like a play on words, right? Esther, haster, right? Nice. But what the rabbis are saying, no. This is the beginning of the time when God is hidden. This is the beginning of the time when you will not see him outright. You're not going to have prophets telling you what God said. You're going to have to figure it out for yourselves. And therefore, that's the second lesson that emerges from Purim. And what is missing in the Megillah? God's name. Right? That is with intent. Because Mordechai and Esther have to see the events as divine without God being there outright. And that becomes the second challenge that emerges from this paradigmatic festival. Next, the very strange statement by Rava that unfortunately too many young people take literally. Chayav Adam Livasume Ad Lo Yoda Bein Baruch Mordechai Bein Arur Haman LeBaruch Mordechai. You've got to become so drunk, says Rava. You've got to become so intoxicated that you can no longer see the difference between Baruch Mordechai and Arur Haman. Now, what? Why? That makes no sense. We live in a world, our Jewish world is based on knowing the difference between Baruch Mordechai and Arur Haman. Right? That Havdalah. Why would I want to be in a situation, or why would I want to create a situation where the lines are blurred? The answer, perhaps, is because the rabbis want us to taste the world. Just a glimpse of the world. You live in a world where Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai are no longer clearly distinguished when you live in this exile world. And do we need to hear that now in our time? In our time, isn't this exactly what's happening? Right? Arur Haman, Baruch Mordechai. Who's Mordechai? Who's Haman here? Right? Forget what happened October 7th. Just worry about what's happening now. Well, don't worry about what will happen in the future. Right? So this is a taste of the world. You've got to taste it. You've got to see it. You've got to see the world for what it is. Next, right? So you've got uncertainty. You've got God's hidden face. You've got an aberrant world. You live in exile. You live in a fragmented nation. There are 4 mitzvot that are unique to Purim. What are they? Manos, Matanos Loev Yomin, Sudas Purim, and Megillah. 2 of them I can clearly understand are connected to Purim. The Megillah and the Seudah. They make sense. But why should there be a mitzvah of Shalach Manos on Purim? What does that have to do with the story? Why should I have a special mitzvah of tzedakah on Purim, when tzedakah is a mitzvah year-round? So the answer lies in understanding that our enemies speak the truth. You got to listen to what they say. Our enemies speak the truth. What does Haman say to Achashverosh? Am echad mefuzar u'meforad bein ha'amin. These guys are not united. They are fragmented. They're spread out across your And what do the rabbis do to correct that? They create 2 mitzvot to strengthen community. And they say those mitzvot have to happen on Purim. We have to give shalach manos to our friends. We've got to strengthen the bonds between ourselves and our neighbors. We've got to take care of the least fortunate on Purim, special. Because we're reversing Haman's truth. And we're trying to come back together. And again, once again, this is so... We're in a time when we've seen tremendous unity, and unfortunately we're seeing some of that unity disintegrate again. Yesterday I went to the Levaya for Daniel Perez, and on the way back we couldn't get home because there was a demonstration against the draft. Against the draft. Right, so you have all of these. So once again, you know, we're together, but.
Why they against the draft? I don't understand.
Because the Haredim don't want to be they don't want to be drafted. The draft. I'm not speaking loud enough. Okay, tell me, remind me. Right. Okay, so therefore you have and. There's another element to this fact that the Megillah talks about a fragmented nation, and that is that different days, different strokes for different folks. You've got Shushan Purim, you've got Purim. What other festival has differences other than the Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golios, which is something else entirely, the second day of Sukkot, the second day of Pesach, something else entirely. All right, let's talk about Shushan Purim. Let's go to E. We celebrate Shushan Purim. Why do we celebrate a different day than others? Where does that emerge from? Right, walled cities. But why? What about walled cities?
Shushan was a walled city.
Shushan was a walled city, and what happened in Shushan to make it up? We're almost there. They had an extra day of fighting. In other words, everywhere else they fought on the 13th of Adar and celebrated on the 14th. In Shushan, they continued fighting on the 14th and celebrated on the 15th. So that's why we're celebrating Shushan Purim. Now, and this is going to sound like Purim talk. What is the characteristic that determines when you celebrate? So you all said it, walled cities, right? Because Shushan was a walled city. Therefore, any city that was walled celebrates like Shushan. But then the Mishnah asks, walled when? At what point in history does a city have to be walled to be considered a walled city? And the Mishnah answers, anyone know? From the time of Yoshua. From the time when Joshua conquered Israel. Says the Gemara, hold on a minute, we got a problem. What's the problem? Anybody know the problem? Shushan wasn't walled at the time of Joshua. So here you go, you're establishing a rule based on Shushan. And what's the answer of the Gemara? Shushan's an exception. Shushan's the exception to the rule that it establishes. Purim Torah, no? No. What are the rabbis teaching us? The rabbis are teaching us that the way you determine time, the way you determine your festivals, will not be based on exile time. It will be based on Eretz Yisrael. And even if that means that you've got to create a rule where what creates the rule is the exception to the rule, that's the way it will be, because you're going to make your time based not on Shushan time. You're describing it, basing your time on Jerusalem time. The time of a walled city at the time of Yoshua. So all of these are paradigmatic lessons that emerge that are critical, not just for Purim itself, but they are paradigmatic messages that emerge concerning exile existence in general. Every single one of them speaks to that experience. But now let's go to the cast of characters. And here we'll see once again that the cast characters are paradigmatic. They are real people who experienced a real story, a real series of events. But every one of them is a paradigm of a kind of character that we're going to encounter over and over and over again in our history. Let's start with the easiest. The easiest is Haman. All right? Haman comes from what nation?
Amalek.
What is the characteristic of Amalek? What do we know about Amalek? So the rabbis say, the Torah says, Asher karcha baderech. They happened upon you on the way. They had no beef. You weren't traveling on their land. There was no reason for the attack. The attack was purposeless. The attack was simply because they wanted to attack you. How do I know that Haman is an Amalekite? Well, the Megillah says Haman Agagi. And Agag was the king of Amalek that was spared against God's wishes by Shaul. But I also know why he's an Amalekite. Because how does he act? Mordechai refuses to bow down. A normal evil person would then do what? You got it. Kill Mordechai, finish, put, done. An Amalekite? I'm not going to just kill Mordechai. I'm going to kill them all. What? For what reason? For what reason? Because I'm an Amalekite. All right, let's go to the second one, to Mordechai. Mordechai represents what? What would you say Mordechai represents? Who is he? In Jewish thought. He's a hero, right? He's a hero. Mordechai is a hero. He's someone who stands up against the evil that Haman represents. But let me ask you a question. If I live in a country where there's a king, and the king says you have to bow down to me, you do it. According to Jewish law, you bow down to the king. So wait a minute. Why? He's a troublemaker. Right? Oh, why is Mordechai refusing to bow down to Haman? So the Torah asks, the Gemara asks this question. And there are all sorts of answers that are offered. One answer is that Haman had an avodah zarah around his neck, so that if you bow down to him, you are bowing down to the avodah zarah. What the rabbis are really saying, I believe, is what Haman represented could not be bowed down to. There are red lines, real red lines, not the kind of red lines that everybody's throwing around.
He wasn't the king either.
He wasn't the king, but the king ordered that you should bow down to him. Right. So what you have is a situation where I'm not going to listen to the king because it is immoral for me to bow down to the likes of a Haman. And therefore you have Mordechai is a complicated figure. He's not just a hero, but he's someone who has to determine what are your red lines. And that recurs and recurs throughout Jewish history over and over and over again as well. Your red lines. What can you do? What can't you do? What can you cross? What can't you cross? It's all part of being a Mordechai. What about Esther? So what does Esther represent? Heroine, correct. But what else?
Interceder.
Someone who intercedes on behalf of the Jews. What else?
She didn't want to do it.
She didn't want to do it, right? She had to be convinced to do it.
Proactive.
There we go. She's a martyr. She's a martyr. Let's understand the seriousness of the story. At the end of the story, everybody's celebrating in the streets of Shushan. Except for who?
Esther.
Where's Esther? And where does she stay? That's it. Esther is lost to Jewish history. She becomes the mother, according to some of the King Darius, right? She plays a role, maybe perhaps in allowing the rebuilding of the temple to resume. But her lineage is no longer part of the Jewish people. She gives up everything. And there is a phrase in the Megillah, which according to Chazal is a phrase that you should be crying at. She says, Kasher avadati avadati. When she agrees to go to the king of her own volition and not force, she says, I'm lost to you. That's it. No more. And she's saying that to Mordechai, and she's saying that to the Jewish people too. I am giving up my life. I am giving up my freedom to save you.
But didn't she give up her freedom marrying him?
She did, but up until that moment of Kasher avadati, she could always claim that she was forced. Mm-hmm. Here she's initiating. This is when she goes, when Mordechai convinces her to go to the king. Once she initiates...
I would say she's forced.
What?
Personally, I would consider that.
That might be force, correct.
You don't have a real choice. I mean, you're not going to give up the opportunity to save your people.
Well, we'll talk about that in a little while. She almost does.
Yeshua becomes the Malcolm Acher.
That's right. That's right. He says somebody else will save. Somebody else will save us. But she is on a legal level. She is of her own volition going to the king. I hear you. Okay, we'll come back to it. If at the end you still feel the same way, you'll let me know. All right. So what do we got? We've got Haman. We've got Mordechai. We've got that leaves, as far as I'm concerned, the most interesting one of all. Achashverosh. Right. I actually wrote about this in Torah Tidbits, so some of you, if you remember it, it's a review. Let's talk about Achashverosh a little bit. Is Achashverosh smart or stupid?
Not too so.
Portray him as stupid.
What? What do you say? Stupid, manipulated, smart.
No.
All right. Okay. The answer is
Up to a point.
Over here,
the debate. Yes.
it is a debate, but he's very smart about survival.
Okay. That's all. Right. There is a debate. There's a debate in the Gemara about whether or not he is stupid, a tipesh or a pikeach. I would argue that they're both right. What do I mean by that? Exactly what you said. He is smart enough to make himself appear stupid. All right? He is smart enough to say, I don't care what happens outside the walls of this palace. As long as it doesn't touch me, as long as it doesn't hurt me, as long as it doesn't affect me, whatever happens can happen. He is the paradigm of the king who cares not a whit about his subjects, but only cares for his own safety, his own security, and his own rulership. Right? And again, we can talk about reappearing and appearing again in our history. And let me prove this to you through a series of texts from the Megillah. Let's start with the first one. Haratzim Yatsu, I'm looking on page number 4, section number 4. Haratzim Yatsu dechufim bidvar hamelech vadas nitna b'shushan abira v'amelech yashru lishtos v'ha'ishir shushan navocha. The edict has gone out. What's the edict?
Kill
That
all the Jews.
When? 11 months from now. 11 months from now, you can kill Jews. How am I supposed to live for the 11 months? It says, Ve'ha'ir Shushan Navocha. It doesn't say the Jews of Shushan were in shock. It says the city of Shushan was in shock. Why? How am I going to behave to my neighbor for the next 11 months? Do I borrow a cup of sugar? Oh,
Yes,
so yeah, don't forget, I'm going to kill you in 10 months. But please, can I borrow some sugar?
Good time to borrow. You don't have to be.
You don't have to return, all right? How do you live for 11 months with this hanging over your head? Who cares? Haman v'hamelech yoshvu lishtos. You couldn't have a more damning phrase than that. Haman and Melech sit down to drink, and everybody else is praised. But Haman and Amalek, they're fine. They're having the party. Let's keep going. Mordechai finds out about this. And he dresses in sackcloth, and he starts screaming in the streets. And he goes until where? Vayavo ad lifnei shar hamelech. He comes up to not up to the gate, but up to in front of the gate. Why? Ki ein lavo el shar hamelech bilvush sak. Because you can't wear sackcloth in the palace. Why not? Why not? It's not. One would argue it's not dignified, but the real answer is because I don't want to know about it. I don't want to know about your problems. Throughout history, there were benevolent kings who had audiences with their subjects. People came in, told them the problems. This king, don't come into my palace. Everything in the palace is light and airy. Right? We keep it that way. We don't want you in sackcloth in the walls of the palace. Stay away. Stay away. Next. Mordechai comes to Esther and says to Esther, you got to go to the king. And she answers, I can't. Right? That's her first answer. And the question is, why can't she?
Nobody asked her to
Yeah.
come.
Because the king has a rule. You have to be invited. And if you're not invited, and he does not extend his scepter, then what?
You get killed.
Wouldn't it be nice to live in a world where I could have a list of people who I want to see every day? And those are the only ones I'm going to see. And everybody else, I don't want to see it. Right? The king is look at what we take this as, this exists, but we take this at face value. But look at what it's saying. It's saying the king will only see Esther's the queen. And even she can't come unless she's invited. Or unless he'll extend his scepter. She's taking her life into her hands, going to the king. So once again, what do you see? You see a king who's creating a world that is totally of his own making, that keeps the world at bay. The rest of the world at bay. Let's keep going. It gets worse. All right? Turn the page. All right, the turning point starting in the Megillah. The king can't sleep. Why can't the king sleep? Because when you try to create a world of your own making, it becomes harder and harder to maintain. And you're seeing people under every rock trying to get you. Big Son and Seresh, others. You don't trust nobody. Right? So come read me a bedtime story. But then we get to the second of the two parties that Esther makes for the king and for Haman. Right? So let's review what happens. She comes to the king extends the scepter, says to her, what do you want? She says, all I want is for you and Haman to come to a party. They come to a party, and he says, now, what do you want? To have the kingdom, I'll give it to you. She says, no, I just want you to come to another party. At that second party, let's take a look at what happens. Right, on page 5. Vayomer HaMelech Achashverosh. I'm looking at the second paragraph. Mihu zeh ve'ezehu. Who is this? You're claiming someone wants to destroy you and your people. Who is this? She points, she says, Haman Arazeh. V'hamelech kom b'chamaso mishtei hayayin el ginas habitan v'Haman omed levakesh al nafsho me'Esther HaMelka. So let's take a look at what happens. She says, Haman Ara. What does the king do? What is his immediate reaction? He runs away. He leaves the room. Why is he leaving the room? Because this is his worst nightmare. The world is now invading the palace. Hold on a minute. Until now, everything was kept at bay. Now this is encroaching on my territory. So what does he do? He runs out to the garden. Haman, for his part, frightened for his life, is prostrating himself before Esther. What happens next? The king comes back in. He sees Haman falling down in front of Esther. And what does he say? Hagam lichbosh es hamalka imi baboyes. What does that mean? Are you trying to seduce the queen? Now let's hold it a minute. Hold it a minute. Are you trying to seduce the queen? Men can be animals. But do you really think that the king thinks that this is what Haman is trying to do at this particular moment, seduce the queen?
I don't think so.
No. He's begging for his life.
Smart.
He's begging for his life. He's not trying to seduce her. So why does the king accuse him of seducing her?
That's the only way to get rid of Haman.
He's rewriting the story, right? He's rewriting the problem. The problem is no longer an edict that's going to kill a whole nation. What's the problem? It's very isolated. It's Haman is trying to seduce the queen. How do you deal with that?
Get rid of Haman.
Get rid of Haman. And if you get rid of Haman, you've taken care of the whole problem. Wow, that's good. That works.
It worked.
Right? So what does he do? He takes care of Haman. He hangs Haman. And as far as he's concerned, fine, finished. Done. Which is why the Megillah says that Esther has to do what? Esther has to then do what? Turn to the bottom of the page on page 5. Vatosef Esther, vatidaber lifnei hamelech, vatipol lifnei raglov. Esther speaks to the king, continues to speak to the king, speaks to him, falls down before his feet. Teich vatischanen lo, she begs and she cries. Lahavir esroas Haman. She says, the king, you're not finished. Now you want to know the miracle of Purim? That he didn't kill Esther. Right? The miracle of Purim is that, what is Esther basically saying to him? I'm not going to let you live. I'm not going to leave you alone unless you deal with this problem. She's forcing him to confront something that he doesn't want to confront. It would have been very easy for him to say, forget Esther. But he doesn't. What does he do? And here we finally see, in its purity, the true evil of an Achashverosh. Does he rescind the verdict? No. Why not?
He doesn't want to
Because kings don't make mistakes.
Why?
So what will he do? He's going to instead, what?
hand the problem to someone
Do a second verdict. What's the second verdict?
The Jew has a right
That
to
the
defend
Jews have a right to defend themselves. Stop. Think for a minute. He is mandating civil war in the streets of his city. Mandating civil war throughout the country. Go ahead, a pox on both your houses. Right? Pox on both your houses. You kill them, have fun, goodbye, leave me alone. You see the evil? And yet this is the evil of an uncaring world. It's the evil that we confront when we confront countries and nations who make decisions only for their own benefit and not for what is really right and true and good.
So did he make that, or did Mordechai decide that?
No, the king.
The king
The
made
king
it.
himself
The king decided that I hereby give the Jews the right to defend themselves.
By perhaps it's a situation like this. Now, king maybe have a second thought. I already issued my original verdict, kill all the Jews. Now I cannot reverse my verdict, tell the Jews, defend your own lives, and then maybe back of his mind, if a Jew is strong and wise enough, they will defend their own lives, and I will not going to be blamed.
Well, that's right. Basically, he's allowing them to protect themselves.
It's amazing that it has to say that he has the right to defend themselves.
That's right.
Right.
Yes.
They
That's right.
can't defend themselves otherwise?
I guess not. I guess not. Maybe he's also allowing them to buy arms now and do all the things that they need to do to prepare for that eventuality. All right. So therefore, you have a situation. So there's your Achashverosh. There in a nutshell is your Achashverosh, the uncaring king, the king who doesn't care a whit for the safety, security of his own subjects, as long as he is protected, as long as he is safe.
Is he not concerned that it may get to him?
He's going to do everything he can to make sure it doesn't.
When they start defending themselves, they'll realize...
He's going to make sure that they don't. He'll put guards outside the gates. He'll do whatever he needs to do. So therefore you have the fourth paradigmatic character. Haman, Esther, Mordecai, Achashverosh. Each one of them characters in a story that took place, each one of them paradigmatic. Each of them are people that will appear and reappear over and over again in the history of the Jewish people and in the history of the world. But now we get to your question. All right, so now let's understand what we've established. That Purim is a paradigmatic festival, that it's seen by the Jews as a paradigm of what occurs over and over again. And we've seen that to be true both in terms of lessons that we learn from the holiday and in terms of lessons we learn from the characters. Yes?
Who decides when a particular event is going to be called paradigmatic?
Who decides? The people. This became what the Jews did. The Jews, when they had an event,
What about the Holocaust? What about other things?
Purim occurred at this particular juncture when exile began, as it were, or exile of choice began, and it becomes paradigmatic of what's going to occur. Of course,
so the Holocaust is called Purim?
The Holocaust is not called Purim.
Right. How come there's not an element of that there?
Because, unfortunately, in the case of the Holocaust, we did not have miraculous salvation. Unfortunately, it ends up being...
So what's happening after the Holocaust with the Jews and Israel being built and everything else, that is not counted as something positive.
One thing I think we have to be very careful about when we talk about the Holocaust.
It's not
If
because
someone,
of that.
right, if someone says, the Holocaust occurred in order so that...
No.
Is it true that as a result of the Holocaust, certain things occurred that allowed us to create Israel? Yes, it is. But it's a very different kind of event. What are the fears when you live in a world of Achashverosh? What are the fears when you live in the world of Achashverosh? Well, the fear number one is that you'll become the victim, right? You're going to become the victim. You're going to be the ability for Amalek to destroy you will exist because Achashverosh will allow it to occur or enable it to occur. But there's a second danger as well. Yes. Take a look at the page 6, a frightening continuing reality. Mordecai goes to Esther and says, you have to go save the Jews. Right? And Esther says, I can't because I can't for the reasons we discussed. How does Mordecai then argue? His first argument should have been what you guys said. His first argument should have been, how can you not save your people at this time? That's not what he says. He says, Al tadami b'nafsheich lihimoleit beis hamelech mikol haYehudim. Don't think you're safe. That the house of the king will escape the fate that occurs to the Yehuda. Don't think that you're safe. Because if you're silent, there will be a Yeshua that comes from somewhere else. Wow. I would have thought that he would first argue, you have to save the Jews. What's he saying to her? Don't think you're safe.
It's like Chuck Schumer.
Because when you live in the world of Achashverosh, there's a second fear.
They think they're going to be
The second fear is that you won't be a victim. The second fear is you will become like Achashverosh. The second fear is that you will become a perpetrator. OUisrael has a beautiful story among the many beautiful stories he has, where he talks about a just man coming to Sodom, screaming and yelling against the inequity that he sees. And after 30 years, a little child comes up to the man and says, don't you realize that what you're doing is futile? Don't you realize that what you're doing is futile? Don't you realize that you haven't changed anybody? Why are you still screaming? And the man turns and says, when I came here, I was screaming to try to change them. Now I'm screaming to stop them from changing me. So that's a part of the frightening reality that exists here. Part of the frightening reality that exists here is that we have to understand that being the victim is a danger and being the perpetrator is a danger. You've got to be able to figure out how to do it. And we try very hard. The world doesn't give us credit for how we try. The world only sees what it wants to see. But when we talk about the things that we do, how many other countries would talk about creating civilian safe havens, for while you're engaging the enemy? What other country would
Not even one.
And what other country would be expected to do?
Not even one country will do.
And the world would not expect it from any other country. For some reason, they expect it from us.
It's a justification.
Therefore, it's important for us to recognize that. It's important for us to recognize that we are struggling not to become like them. We are struggling to retain our dignity. We are struggling to retain our humanity. And it's very hard. It's very hard. Now we can go back to the very first question we asked. Right? I told you to store it in your brain, and I said we'll come back to it.
Repeat it, please. I'll drain my brain.
Yeah, I'll repeat it. Why is it that we celebrate Purim in the second month of Adar and not the first? Ema Birin al Mitzvot is a principle that's established that is used throughout Jewish law. Why is it that in this one case I allow myself to delay, and I have to celebrate Purim in the shadow of Pesach? Why? But why? Gula should, right? But why? It's a beautiful statement. Gula, that the two Gula stories should be in proximity to each other. But why? They're very different. They're different holidays. They're different stories. What's the connection?
Pesach seems to be a one-time event. Purim teaches us that it's a continuing event.
Okay.
That the Geula has to be earned continuously.
Okay. I'm going to take that and play with it a little bit.
One was God's hand, and one was...
One's God's hand, and one is man acting on what he thinks is God's hand, right?
And it also gives us a sense of hope that being in a situation
gives us a sense of hope, she says. That I'll take all of the things you're saying and merge them and say the following. Yes, go ahead.
It's only by putting them in proximity with one another that Adar is possible to be a happy month.
Adar is what?
Possible to be a happy month?
I mean, we're supposed to have a level of simcha. Without the brackets,
all right, I'll take it a little bit differently. Go ahead.
Just say, I always had a problem with the celebration on Purim because what I see as a child of survivors is what almost happened.
All right, what almost happened, correct. So what are we saying? We're saying that the Purim story must be seen in the shadow of Pesach. We're saying that what makes Purim is when Mordecai and Esther turn around and say, God didn't tell us what to do. He's not clearly visible in this story, but we believe that it is a miraculous event that is part and parcel of Jewish history in totality. And the holiday that celebrates Jewish history in its totality is Pesach. So you have to see Purim in the shadow of Pesach. You have to see your Purim. Each of those Purims that were listed earlier on the page, they all have to be seen in the shadow of Pesach. They have to be seen by those to whom it occurred. They have to be seen as what? As stories that can be relegated to Jewish history as a whole, that are part of the flow of Jewish history. And therefore Purim is placed near Pesach, so you don't see it as an individual event. You don't see it as an isolated event, but you see it as an event that's part and parcel of Jewish history. And each generation has the same challenge to see its story, to see its Purim, to see its story in the shadow of Pesach. We have to see what's happening now in the shadow of Jewish history. You have to somehow be able to see it and recognize it not for what it is as it's happening, but what it represents in its totality. And therefore Purim must be close to Pesach.
I also feel that we can really sense the power of one or two people who made such a difference in our history. And we see it in every kind of situation.
Correct. You can see people stepping up and making a difference, and the story emerges when Mordecai and Esther step up and take that role.